One of the most harmful things that you can do to your kid as far as their long-term physical, mental, emotional, relational life, how they relate to other people, is shame. But unfortunately, so many of us were brought up in paradigms and in discipline kind of mindsets that used shame. And so for so many of us, we're having to actively work against the natural default of what we experienced as parenting to do things differently. And so breaking the shame cycle is really, really difficult. And if you're watching this video and you have already maybe read a blog post that I've written about why shame is so problematic, or read an email, you're on my email list and you received an email about why shame is so problematic, and you're ready to change, this is the video for you. I'm going to talk you through the 3-step process that I use with parents to help them to break down, deconstruct this shame paradigm, and actually parent without shame while still practicing effective discipline, because it is really important that we discipline our kids in an effective way that teaches them to grow up into be, again, physically, mentally, emotionally, relationally healthy and fulfilled human beings. So step 1 is, instead of leading with correction, which often comes with shame or shaming, we are going to lead with empathy. So when we find our kids in some problematic scenario, when they're misbehaving in some way, or they hurt one of their siblings, or maybe, they're just doing things that are unhelpful and unfruitful for the family life, whatever that may be, coloring on the walls, for example. Instead of shaming them and correcting them in the moment, what are you doing? You're so naughty for doing this. Or, I'm so disappointed in you because you did X, Y, and Z. We're going to lead with empathy and connection. Empathy is the practice of trying to put yourself in somebody else's shoes. It's perspective taking 101. And kind of unsurprisingly, empathy is one of the things that is most predictive of long-term physical, mental, emotional, relational health. People who are good at practicing empathy have much more positive relationships with themselves and others than people who aren't good at practicing empathy. And I think that parents who even use shame understand this, and this is oftentimes what they're trying to shoot for when they're shaming their kids. When they find their kid hurting another kid, they say, like, I'm so disappointed in you. I don't want you to do that. Look at how you're making them feel. But ultimately, this is really counterproductive, because you can't teach empathy to somebody after you've shamed them, because shame is kind of the opposite of empathy. Empathy comes from a place of feeling deeply connected to a community. Shame comes from a place of feeling like you might not have a place in that community anymore. And so it's really kind of counterintuitive for a lot of people who grew up in the 80s and 90s, but you can't really make someone feel bad into empathy. It just doesn't, like, those things don't translate well. Instead, when you shame someone, what they go to or what they think about is how sorry for themselves they feel. So they feel like, oh man, I am bad and I shouldn't have done that. And they become the self-centered focus of the discipline, whatever the discipline is. They don't think about how their actions are affecting someone else. They're just thinking about how their actions are affecting you, their caregiver, and then, kind of transitively affecting them, how what they did is making them feel right now. That's not what we want to do. We want them to think about how they're making other people feel. And the best way to teach empathy is to model empathy. So when you find your kid doing something problematic, try and go alongside them and say things like, wow, I can see that you're really frustrated right now. Or, hey, I can see that you're really mad about X, Y, Z. You're mad about, for example, my son was having a meltdown about his kite recently. He just got a kite and he really wants to use it, but he doesn't know how yet. And so, he would fly his kite into the ground and he would get really, really frustrated. And he walked over and stamped, on his kite and was really upset. And I went over to him and I said, I remember what it is to be really frustrated about something that's not going well. And, I totally get it. I understand it. It's normal to be frustrated. All of this normalizing language actually promotes empathy, because once your child can feel like, man, this doesn't make me bad to feel this way, then they can actually start putting themselves into other people's shoes and saying, oh, when I do these things, it made this other person, not feel good in their body, for example, right? Like if your kid hits another kid, You don't want them to not hit another kid because they're going to be punished or because they're going to feel ashamed. You want them to not hit other kids because they know that hurting someone is not good, because if they were in their shoes, they wouldn't want to be hurt. So leading with empathy and connection, trying to connect deeply with the emotional state of your child and putting yourself into that realm where you're trying to understand deeply before you try and correct whatever they've done as a response to why they're upset. If you start by going in and saying, no, I just want to understand why you're upset, and I want to understand what's going on here, and I want to understand how you're feeling, and I want to affirm and validate those feelings, not only is your child going to feel like, man, I'm watching empathy be modeled to me, and whatever you model to your kids, they're going to do to other people. That's just like parenting 101. Not only that, you're actually going to get into a position where you're not going to be so triggered because you're intentionally practicing empathy. You know, there's this phrase out there that I really like to use. We fake it until we make it in parenting. And it's not that we fake it until we make it because we want to be inauthentic. It's that we fake it until we make it because actually practicing intentional empathy, even when you don't feel like it, will get your brain into a place where you will feel like it. It's kind of like when you smile, even if you're unhappy, sometimes you will feel better because practicing faking it until you make it actually works in that way. So practicing empathy and perspective taking with your kid is not only going to model to them how to do it, it's also going to help them in the moment, to help you in the moment to empathize with them better so that your discipline is going to be more effective. So that's step one. Instead of leading with correction and shame, which is probably your initial response if you were like me and you were brought up in shame paradigms, you're going to lead with empathy and connection, just trying to connect to the feelings that they're having, understand them, and validate them. Step two is one of the simplest things in the world, but it's one of the most difficult things in this entire video, and that is to rely on the natural consequences of your kids' actions. Oftentimes, when our kids do something that breaks community with us, or they hurt someone else, or they do something like color all over the walls, like I said before, our natural response is to want to make them feel bad about what they've done. But the thing is, the natural consequences of what they've done, once the dust settles, are going to make them feel guilty by themselves. We don't need to add to that. Our kids actually have built-in moral compasses that they're going to feel not great about what they've done once we direct their attention to that consequence. I remember last night I was going through this with my son, and it was bedtime. Again, it's kite related because everything is kites in our family right now. But it was bedtime and he wanted to do reading time outside. It was the first warm day in Chicagoland, or warm evening, I should say. We have this kind of fake spring thing where it pretends to be spring in the beginning of April, and then it'll get like cold and snow again, probably in a week. But last night it was warm. And so we went outside, and all of our patio furniture was set up that day. And he was like, I want to do story time outside with you underneath the gazebo. That's what I want to do. And so that's what we did. We got the book out. We got a blanket out because it wasn't super, super warm still. And we all cuddled up under the blanket. And then come bursting through the gate is some neighborhood kids who go to bed much later than he does. And I'm not judging their parenting decisions. They have a different life than we do. But yeah. They're his age, but they go to bed 2 or 3 hours after he does. He goes to bed about 7 o'clock. And so they come bursting in and they're like, let's play. We can play for a couple more hours before bedtime. And he immediately responds, no, we can't play. It's story time, et cetera, et cetera. And they're like, but we wanted to fly the kite with you. And this is all my son has been wanting to do. So he's like, yeah, Dad, can we fly the kite? I want to go fly the kite with my friends. And, you know, a long story short, we kind of go back and forth, and I'm trying to offer him like, you know, this is really a time for us to be winding down. This isn't a time for us to be doing a lot of active stuff like going out and flying a kite. Story time is designed to kind of get us to calm down before it's time for bed. And we're going through this, I don't know, conversation, and I can see that he's starting to get escalated, and I'm trying to diffuse it, but he kind of resists all the diffusing and eventually gets to a point where he just like goes full on meltdown. He's crying. The neighborhood kids who have just been banished from our backyard because it's time for bed, we can hear them crying on the other side of the fence. He like takes off, is about to he wants to run out his energy a lot. So he just goes running out the front gate. And I'm like, oh man, we got to go to bed in 10 minutes. This is not ideal. And, through all of this, I'm trying to kind of wrangle things back in, and I'm getting triggered and frustrated. We'll get to that in step 3, but I'm starting to get triggered and frustrated. I'm trying to do my best to empathize with him, but it's really, really hard. And time is just ticking away, right? This is what happens. And so he's not having a good time. He's very upset. He's very escalated. When your kids are in these meltdown states, they don't like it either, right? They're not doing it for attention or anything like that. Maybe their need is attention, but they don't want to be like that. And so at the end of it, after he's kind of calmed down, it's half an hour's past, 45 minutes maybe. And there is really no time to do anything other than get PJs on and go to bed. That's just the reality of the situation. That's not a punishment. That's just the reality, right? That's the reality of the consequences. And the entire time, I really wanted to threaten him, and I wanted to shame him for running away, and I wanted to do all of these kind of traditional parenting practices, because once I started getting triggered, that's what I wanted to default to. But I kept reminding myself, just persevere, right? Just get to the end of the meltdown. Just make it to the end of the meltdown. And so when we made it to the end of the meltdown and we get the PJs on and we brush teeth and we go upstairs and we lay down in bed, he all of a sudden realizes we never read our story. We'd only gotten through maybe a sentence before the friends came over. And he was really not happy about that. He was very upset about that. He was very sad about that. This is a very special connection time that we have every night. And because, the dysregulation happened and the running away and, resisting efforts to try and calm down and all of that stuff, the natural consequence of that was that time ran out and there was no time for us to read the story anymore. And he cried, it was sad for him. He didn't like it. But had at any point during that process, had I tried to threaten or add additional consequences or punishments, I would have distracted away from the actual consequence of, running around at bedtime and not getting ready for bed and doing all that, which is that you miss out on the deep, awesome connection that is story time. That is one of his favorite parts of the day. And so I felt really bad for him, but I didn't have to add anything to that. The natural consequence was going to do its work. All I had to do was wait it out and rely on the natural consequence. And it wasn't I did have a part in that I could direct his attention to that, but I didn't have to add additional consequences or punishments to it. So often, and I would say 95% of the time, the thing that our kid is doing, the natural outcome of that is enough of a consequence, is enough of a, deterrent for the next time. It'll make them think twice the next time without us adding anything to it. And a lot of people say, well, okay, well, what's the natural consequence for this or this or this or this? And ultimately, we don't always know. I didn't know what the natural consequence was going to be in the moment. I just had to rely on the fact that I knew that he didn't feel good about this, even if the natural consequence was just, hey, was that good? Did that feel good to run around the block? And maybe it did. Maybe the consequence was a positive one. Yeah, it felt good. And I got my energy out and I needed to do that. And I felt upset all day and I needed to get energy out. So we just rely on the natural outcomes. And I know that that's so hard. Like I said, it's the simplest thing in the world just to wait out the storm. And I'm going to help you with that in step 3. But if we can do it, I think that oftentimes we don't need to resort to shame or punishment or making our kid feel bad about something, which ultimately is what we're trying to do with shame. We're trying to make them feel bad. They're going to feel bad all on their own in ways that are actually effective at teaching them long-term. Because that's what's going to teach him long-term is the reality of his situation, not me arbitrarily adding something or shaming him. All shame ever teaches kids is that their parents will shame them. That's it. All right, step 3, we are on the home stretch. Revisit down the road. This step is all about deconstructing one of the biggest myths in parenting. And that is that when you find your child doing something problematic or something that you wish that they weren't doing, that is the time to discipline them. It's not. The reason that it's not is twofold. Number one, you are not in a state to discipline at that moment. And I'll get back to that in just a moment. Number two is that they are not in a state to be disciplined, to learn anything right after you've just caught them in a situation that they can tell you are not happy about. When you find your kid, whether it's doing something that they know is not great, or especially when they are doing something that they don't know isn't great, and you come upon them and it's very obvious to them very quickly, I shouldn't be doing this, they go into fight or flight. This is often the time when we want to tower over them because this is maybe what happened to us, and to shame and say, I can't believe that you're doing this. Why are you doing this? What's wrong with you? Whatever. I'm so disappointed in you, right? Another really classic shame tactic from parents. But they already feel that. They're already in their limbic system, in their fight or flight system. Nothing that we say in that moment is going to do a lick of good. It's just going to pile on to an already escalating and dysregulating experience that's going on in their body. And so actually, it's the worst possible time for us to try and teach them or discipline them in any way. In fact, if we just wait until they're back to, a prefrontal cortex logical place, whether they're playing a couple minutes later or even the next day, if it's something that happens, close to bedtime and they don't ever really come down before they go to sleep, then we will find that the discipline, the teaching, the lesson that we're trying to offer them will stick so much better. And that's because their brain will be able to literally take in that information in a much healthier way. It won't be stored as kind of this part of this fear-based response that they had, or this big emotional response that they have. They'll actually be able to think it through. And when they go to make decisions in the future, that information will be more readily available to their brain, to their logic centers. To the first point, I think this is even more to the point because we're discussing shame. It's also a time when you're probably not in a place where you're going to be at your best. In fact, when I talk to parents about when they often find themselves parenting in such a way that they're not super happy about after the fact, whether that's shaming their kids or punishing their kids or screaming at their kids, it's when they're triggered. These things don't happen as thought out, thought through, oh, I'm going to employ this potentially damaging tactic of parenting to my kids. That's not when it comes up. It comes up for us when we are dysregulated, when we are triggered, when our kids' big emotions actually have the same limbic resonance response to us, when we feed off of our kids' dysfunction and then feel escalated about whatever is happening. When our blood pressure's up, our heart rate's up, when our fists are clenched, when our palms are sweaty, these are not the times to be parenting effectively. Really, in these moments, you just want to survive until you get to a place of calm, collected, logical thinking, and then you can go back and revisit the discipline. Your kid is not a dog. They don't need you to correct misbehavior in the moment for them to be able to internalize that it's not a great thing to do. You can come back an hour or even a day or even multiple days later once you've gotten a handle on your emotions and once they're in a place to think, teach, or to be teachable and to think critically and to really learn. Educators have known this forever, guys. This is something that parenting has just gotten plainly wrong. If we do not deconstruct this myth that we have to correct or, punish or come down on kids in the moment when they're doing something wrong, if we don't get this right, we're going to wind up going over and over and over the same things and parenting in ways that we are embarrassed about later, that we don't want to act. Shame is one of these things. It often comes out, perhaps even primarily comes out when we are escalated. And that's because, by the way, oftentimes the very thing that we're shaming our kid for is something that we were shamed for as a child. And when we see them in this situation, whatever it is that they're doing, our childhood trauma of feeling that shame, of that corrosive, yuck, I'm disconnected from my community feeling, that maybe I'm unlovable, maybe I'm the problem feeling that comes with shame, when that feeling bubbles up in us because we find our kid doing the same thing that made us feel unlovable, we will oftentimes project our own discomfort and shame onto our kids. So what's step one? Lead with empathy. Do your best to understand your child's perspective. How did they get into the situation, whatever it is? How, are they finding themselves? Did they even know what they were doing was not necessarily something that's going to lead to flourishing? One time I found my son with a red Sharpie coloring all over our brand new deck because he thought that when it rained, it would wash it off. Obviously, he didn't know in that moment. I easily could have shamed him for that, but because I led with empathy, I knew in that moment, you know what? What's the greater story? What's the real story here going on? So lead with empathy and connection. Number two, rely on the consequences that are already present. Your kid is going to absolutely feel the guilt associated with whatever they've done when those consequences come to bear. If they hurt somebody and that person doesn't want to play with them anymore, or is crying or is hurt, if you're helping your kid to develop empathy, that's going to be a consequence all on its own. You don't need to heap things on top of your kids. And oftentimes we just need to wait it out until we're at a calm place where that consequence where we can direct our kids' attention to that consequence and it will, take its full effect, for lack of a better term. And number three, to make sure that we are parenting with the right timing, to not try and go after our kids in the moment when something's going on, when we're likely to fall into patterns and cycles of shame, but rather to, just get through the present moment, find ways to calm down in that moment. Don't, maybe you have to grab the red Sharpie out of their hand or take them out of a situation where they're hurting someone or something like that. You have to physically remove them, but you don't have to correct and discipline until your child's in a calm and regulated state and until you are in a calm, regulated state. You do those three things, you are going to find that you can parent without shame, without having to resort to shame, because shame is harmful, it's corrosive, it's not going to help you long-term. And yeah, I hope you got something out of it. Good luck parenting without shame.